The late afternoon sun was slipping through the tall windows of the community center, giving the old room a warm glow that made everything inside feel a little softer. People were gathered for the small weekly meetup, chatting in quiet groups, waiting for the activities to begin. There was nothing grand about this place. The chairs were mismatched, the paint on the walls had faded over the years, and the piano in the corner looked like it hadn't been tuned in a long time. But somehow, the room felt peaceful, like a safe place where people came to unwind after long days. She sat quietly near the back, listening more than talking, the way she always did. She wasn't the type to force herself into conversations. Instead, she watched people, listened to the rhythm of their voices, and tried to understand the stories behind their expressions. Even when she sat in silence, her mind was never still. She noticed everything. The way someone rubbed their hands together when nervous, the way laughter filled the room even when people were pretending to be confident, the small bits of life hidden between ordinary moments. The old piano stood in the corner, ignored by almost everyone. Most people only thought of it as a decoration. Sometimes someone would press a few keys as a joke, then walk away when they heard the uneven sound. But today, something about it kept pulling her attention. Her fingers twitched slightly every time she glanced at it. She told herself she wouldn't do anything. She told herself it wasn't the right time. But even as she tried to push the thought away, the desire to play kept growing. She had been sitting there for almost an hour when the instructor walked into the center of the room and clapped their hands. Everyone grew quiet, waiting to hear what would happen next. It was supposed to be a relaxed gathering, but people still liked a bit of structure. The instructor talked about the usual things: upcoming events, feedback from last week, reminders about keeping the space clean. Then they asked if anyone wanted to share something. A poem, a short talk, a skill, anything simple. The room stayed silent for a moment. People looked around but no one raised a hand. That was when she felt a strange courage build in her chest. It wasn't loud or bold. It was soft, like a whisper, but strong enough to push her out of her seat. Before she realized what she was doing, she lifted her hand. The instructor noticed her and smiled. "Please," someone finally volunteered. "Yes? You want to share something?" She hesitated for a moment, feeling her heartbeat pick up. Her voice came out gentle but clear. "Can I play the piano?" For a brief second, the room stayed quiet, and she hoped maybe it would be fine. But then a couple of people laughed. Not loud, but sharp enough to be heard. A small group exchanged glances, as if her request was strange or unrealistic. One person chuckled under their breath as if they already knew how this would end. The room wasn't cruel, but the laughter carried an assumption. She didn't seem like someone who could play anything meaningful. She kept her expression calm. She had learned long ago that reacting never helped. People often judged before they understood. She wasn't surprised, but it still stung. She looked back at the instructor, waiting for their answer. The instructor seemed unsure. They looked at the piano, then back at her. "You want to try? The keys are a bit old, but if you really want to, you can." That was enough. She nodded once and stood up. As she walked toward the piano, she could feel eyes following her. Some curious, some doubtful, some amused. She heard whispers, though she couldn't make out the words. Her steps were slow but steady. She didn't rush. She didn't shrink. She simply moved forward like someone who accepted whatever would come next. The piano looked even older up close. The wood was faded, and one of the legs had a small crack near the bottom. Dust had collected under the curved edge. She pulled the bench out gently and sat down. Her hands hovered above the keys but didn't touch them yet. Her breath felt tight in her chest, but she pushed through the feeling. Behind her, a couple of people were still smiling in that way people do when they assume nothing impressive is about to happen. She heard one person whisper, "This should be interesting," and another let out a small laugh. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to see their expressions. She already knew. She placed her fingers on the keys but didn't press yet. She took a slow breath, grounding herself quietly. In her mind, she reminded herself why she wanted to do this. Not to impress anyone. Not to prove anyone wrong. She wanted to do it because playing the piano made her feel like herself. Calm, focused, alive in a way words couldn't express. But even as she tried to stay calm, her hands trembled. She had never played in front of strangers before. She had never played in front of anyone except the walls of her home. Those walls never judged, never laughed, never doubted. For a moment she almost stood up and walked away. She thought maybe it was better to avoid the attention. Maybe the laughter would grow louder if she made a mistake. Maybe it wasn't worth it. But then she remembered all the nights she stayed awake practicing quietly so she wouldn't disturb anyone. She remembered how the notes felt under her fingers, how music gave her a place to breathe when the world felt heavy. She remembered how long she had waited to share this part of herself. And she reminded herself that even if people didn't believe in her, she didn't owe them fear. She pressed one key. The sound was soft but clear. She pressed another, then another. The piano was old but workable. She could make this work. She closed her eyes for a second and allowed herself to settle into the moment. Then she started playing a short warm-up, barely tapping the keys to test their condition. The room behind her shifted slightly. People were paying attention, even the ones who had laughed. The instructor stepped back to give her space, watching her with a mixture of curiosity and caution. The murmurs began to fade as more people focused on her. She could feel the room holding its breath, not because they expected greatness, but because they weren't sure what was going to happen. She continued running her fingers lightly across the keys, building a small rhythm. It wasn't a song yet, just preparation. But even that was enough to bring quiet to the room. And then she stopped. She lifted her hands and rested them gently above the keys once more. This time she didn't hesitate. She was ready. In the stillness of the room, she made the decision to play. Not for them, not to silence anyone, but because this was the first time she allowed herself to be seen for who she truly was. She took one final breath and placed her fingers in position. The laughter behind her had faded completely. Even the air felt different, like the room was waiting. She pressed the first key with confidence. And the story of that moment began. The room had grown so quiet that even the faint buzzing of the old ceiling fan seemed louder than before. People who had been chatting earlier now stood still, curious about what she was about to do. The piano sat in front of her like a challenge and an invitation at the same time. Her fingers rested lightly on the keys, waiting to begin. But before the first real note came, the memory of the laughter she heard earlier echoed in her mind. It wasn't the first time people laughed at her. She had grown used to the small reactions people gave whenever she stepped out of her quiet shell. Most of the time, she kept her distance to avoid that feeling. But today, those soft laughs carried a weight they didn't understand. They didn't know her. They didn't know the hours she spent practicing alone. They didn't know how deeply she loved the sound of the piano. Behind her, a couple of teens leaned against the wall with amused expressions. They whispered to each other, thinking she couldn't hear them. "She really thinks she can play?" one said softly. Another snickered, covering their mouth like they were trying to be polite but failing. People tend to judge quickly, especially when someone quiet suddenly decides to step into the light. To them, she was just a girl who barely spoke, someone who always blended into the background. They assumed she had nothing special to offer. But assumptions are easy to make when you haven't seen someone's story. She kept her eyes on the keys, pretending not to notice the whispers behind her. But inside, she felt a small sting. Not enough to break her, but enough to remind her of all the other times people underestimated her. She let the feeling sit for a moment, then released it slowly, reminding herself why she had raised her hand in the first place. The instructor stood off to the side, watching her with a cautious kind of interest. They didn't laugh, but they definitely didn't expect anything remarkable. Even they seemed unsure of whether she could play. They crossed their arms gently, waiting. She inhaled deeply and began pressing a soft series of notes. It wasn't a full song yet, just a test to hear how the keys responded. Each sound gave her a better sense of how much pressure she needed, how the worn-out piano reacted to her touch. The warm-up was simple, but even in those light touches, something sincere came through. Slowly, the room shifted. The laughter behind her faded. People leaned forward a little, trying to listen. She wasn't playing confidently yet, but the careful gentleness of her warm-up hinted that she wasn't just randomly pressing keys. There was intention in the way her fingers moved. She continued the warm-up for a few more seconds, then stopped. Her heart beat faster. She felt the weight of the room pressing gently on her shoulders, not cruelly but expectantly. She hadn't felt this exposed in a long time. A part of her wanted to disappear. Another part of her wanted to show them everything she had been holding inside. As she sat there, a memory flashed in her mind. One of herself sitting in her small room at home. The light from her desk lamp had cast a soft glow on the keyboard she practiced on. It wasn't a real piano, just a cheap digital one with uneven sound, but it was enough for her. Every night after finishing chores and homework, she would sit there, letting her fingers wander over the keys. No one ever saw her practice. No one knew how many hours she gave to music. It wasn't something she talked about. She never sought praise or attention. She played because it made her feel grounded, like she could breathe easier when the world felt heavy. Back in the community center, her breathing steadied. She let her fingers settle into the starting position for the piece she planned to play. It wasn't a famous song. It wasn't something that would win competitions. It was a piece she had created slowly over months, adding small details until it felt like something that truly belonged to her. She pressed the first real note. The sound was richer than before. Not perfect, but full enough to fill the quiet room. She continued, her fingers moving in slow, flowing patterns. The melody rose gently, like a morning breeze moving through soft curtains. It was simple but emotional, the kind of sound that made people stop just to feel it. The instructor tilted their heads slightly, surprised. The teens who had been whispering earlier looked at each other, their amusement fading. Someone near the door took a step forward, wanting a better look. She didn't notice any of this. She was lost in the music. Each note carried a piece of her story, the loneliness of her childhood, the comfort she found in the piano, the small courage it took to raise her hand earlier. She wasn't showing off. She was sharing a part of herself she had kept hidden for too long. As she played, her posture changed. Her shoulders relaxed. Her hands stopped trembling. The soft glow of the sunset coming through the windows made her silhouette look almost peaceful. People in the room felt that calmness spreading, like the music was smoothing out the noise inside their minds. The whispers behind her had vanished completely. No one laughed anymore. They listened. The song built slowly, adding layers that deepened the mood of the room. It wasn't about how skilled she was. It was about how present she seemed, how much emotion flowed through each note. That authenticity pulled everyone in. Some people exchanged quiet looks of surprise. A few nodded softly, impressed without expecting to be. Even the ceiling fan seemed to spin more quietly now. While she played, more memories drifted into her mind. She remembered being younger, sitting at a different piano in a relative's home. That was where she first learned how to place her fingers correctly. She remembered the first time she realized she could create sounds that felt like stories. She remembered how she tried to hide that love when people teased her for being too quiet. In the present moment, those memories didn't hurt anymore. They guided her hands calmly, reminding her why she kept going. She continued playing until she reached the middle part of her piece, the part where the melody dipped into a soft, thoughtful tone. The room felt as though it held its breath again. People were no longer looking at her like she was someone who didn't belong at the piano. They were seeing her differently now, though she didn't notice it yet. One person near the back leaned toward another and whispered, "She's actually good." But it wasn't said with disbelief this time. It was said with respect. The instructor uncrossed their arms and lowered their hands, their eyes following her movements carefully. They weren't judging anymore. They were appreciating. Her fingers flowed with more confidence as she began the next part of the piece. The sound rose a little higher, carrying warmth through the entire room. Some people in the crowd felt strangely emotional, though none of them knew why. Maybe it was the honesty of the music. Maybe it was the quiet strength behind her playing. She didn't rush. She let each note land gently before moving to the next. The piano wasn't perfect, but she made it sound more graceful than anyone expected. Even the old keys responded with surprising clarity when she pressed them. She didn't think about the laughter anymore. She didn't think about the people watching. She was somewhere else now. Somewhere inside the melody she had carried for years. The room could have disappeared and she wouldn't have noticed. But the people watching noticed everything. They saw the way her fingers moved as if they belonged to the keys. They heard the shift from soft notes to slightly louder ones, each one placed with care. They felt the emotional weight in the air, like her music was telling them something even though she didn't speak. No one laughed. No one whispered. No one mocked. The entire room had fallen under the gentle spell of her playing. She was no longer the girl they assumed she was. In this moment, she was something else. Someone confident, someone talented, someone who held the room without ever raising her voice. As her song continued to unfold, they realized they had been wrong about her. But she didn't know that yet. She just kept playing, letting the music reveal the truth they hadn't seen before. She kept her hands moving over the keys as if the piano had been waiting just for her. The room had grown so quiet that each note felt like a breath filling the space, soft but full of meaning. But even as she played, her mind drifted to the past, moving through memories she rarely allowed herself to revisit. She had not always been comfortable around people. Growing up, she was the quiet one in the room, the one who sat near the corner during gatherings, the one who listened more than she spoke. People often misunderstood silence. They thought it meant weakness or uncertainty, when in reality it was the place she felt safest. The first time she ever touched a piano, she was barely tall enough to reach the keys properly. It happened during a visit to a relative's house, where an old upright piano sat in the living room like a forgotten treasure. No one really used it, at least not seriously. Sometimes a child would pound on the keys for fun, but no one in the house truly played. She remembered how she approached it that day. She didn't touch it right away. She simply stared, noticing the way the light reflected off its polished surface. Something about it called to her, like it was trying to tell her that there was a world behind those keys she hadn't discovered yet. When she pressed the first note, the sound surprised her. Felt alive. Felt like a voice she had been waiting to hear. From that moment on, she returned to the piano every time they visited. At first, she only pressed random keys, listening to the different tones with wide eyes. But soon she began to find patterns, simple rhythms that she repeated again and again until they sounded intentional. She didn't know how to read music. She didn't have a teacher. Everything she learned came from listening, feeling, observing. Years later, when her family could no longer visit that house often, she felt a strange emptiness. She had no piano at home, and she missed the sound so much that sometimes she would tap her fingers on desks, pretending she could hear the notes. But life, in its quiet way, always leaves small doors open. One afternoon, while walking home, she passed by a thrift shop she hadn't noticed before. Inside, barely visible in the corner, was an old digital keyboard with scratches on its sides. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't powerful. But it worked. She saved for weeks just to buy it. She cut back on small things, skipped snacks, did extra chores, all so she could gather enough money. The day she brought it home, she felt like she had brought home a piece of herself that had been missing. Every night she practiced. Some days she learned new melodies from online tutorials. Some days she simply played what she felt. She created little pieces that only she heard. Small parts of her heart turned into sound. She didn't play for praise. She didn't play for an audience. She played because it was the only place where she felt completely honest. She continued playing at the community center now, her fingers graceful and steady. The room around her still didn't know this part of her life, this long road of quietly building her skills in the shadows. To them, she was just a girl who asked to play the piano out of nowhere. But her music carried years of private moments, evenings filled with soft light, and the gentle patience she gave herself when no one else paid attention. Her thoughts drifted to another memory, the first time someone questioned her love for the piano. She had been practicing in her room one evening when a relative walked by her door and paused. They watched her for a moment before saying, "You're wasting your time. You should do something more useful." She remembered how those words cut into her, not because they were loud, but because they came from someone whose opinion she had once valued. She didn't respond. She simply lowered the volume and continued playing, but something inside her shifted. From that day on, she practiced with even more determination. Not to prove anyone wrong, but to remind herself that things people don't understand can still have value. Now, at the community center, she reached the more emotional part of the song. Her fingers slowed, pressing the keys with a gentle weight as though she were touching a memory itself. The melody softened into something tender, and the people in the room felt the shift. Someone near the front placed a hand over their chest without realizing it. Another person blinked slowly, touched by the sincerity in her playing. Even those who came in late, expecting noise and chatter, stopped near the doorway, drawn by the sound. She didn't see any of this. Her eyes were half closed, focused only on the music and the emotions that rose with each note. While her fingers moved, she remembered the nights she cried quietly when the world felt too heavy. She remembered how she would sit at the keyboard afterward, letting the soft glow of the lamp light the room as she played her way out of sadness. Music had always been her way of stitching herself back together. She remembered moments of joy too, like the time she finally mastered a piece she had struggled with for months. The rush of happiness she felt then was something she never shared with anyone, but it stayed with her like a small, warm flame. All of these memories flowed into her playing now. As she reached the middle of the song, her fingers moved with a calm confidence she rarely felt in everyday life. The room watched her like a story unfolding, each note a sentence, each pause a quiet breath. The instructor, who had been skeptical earlier, now stood fully focused. Their eyebrows lifted slightly with each shift in the melody. They seemed to realize little by little that she wasn't just someone who wanted attention. She was someone who carried a real gift, one shaped through patience and self-teaching. A person sitting near the back whispered softly, "I didn't know she could play like that." Their voice held no judgment now, only surprise. Another person nodded slowly. Nobody knew. There was something beautiful about this moment. The room had come together, not with loud excitement but with a quiet appreciation, like everyone shared a gentle understanding of what was happening. As she continued playing, she remembered the day she almost gave up music altogether. Her keyboard had broken unexpectedly. It simply stopped working one morning. She tried fixing it, pressing buttons, checking cables, but nothing helped. She sat on the floor next to it, feeling like she had lost a friend. For several days she felt lost, unsure if she should save up again or just let it go. But something inside her refused to let her stop. Little by little, she started saving again, and eventually, she bought another used keyboard from a small shop. It wasn't perfect either, but it worked. Those struggles had taught her that things worth loving aren't always easy. Sometimes they break. Sometimes they disappear. Sometimes the world laughs at you for loving them. But if they matter to you, you find your way back. Now, as she played at the community center, each note felt like a reminder of that resilience. The song began building again, growing in emotion. Her fingers moved more freely, and her posture straightened slightly as though she had found a deeper part of herself. People in the room sensed the shift. The melody grew richer, fuller, carrying a quiet strength that spread through the space. Someone near the window closed their eyes, letting the sound wash over them. Even those who had laughed earlier felt their cheeks warm with a quiet shame. They hadn't expected anything from her. They hadn't given her a chance. Yet here she was, filling the room with something so honest that none of them knew how to respond. She still didn't think about them. She didn't care about their earlier reactions. She simply played, letting the music reveal the truth she had kept inside for years. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't hiding. She wasn't shrinking. She wasn't trying to blend into the background. She was simply herself. And that was enough. As the final section of the song approached, the room leaned in, sensing something meaningful was coming. She didn't see their faces or hear their breaths, but she felt the shift in the air. Her fingers danced softly over the keys, carrying everything she remembered. Her quiet childhood, her late-night practices, her moments of doubt, her stubborn determination, and the soft courage she found within herself. All of it came together in this single moment. She played the last note with a gentle, lingering touch that floated through the room before fading into silence. The sound vanished, but the feeling stayed. For a heartbeat, the room didn't move. They were ready to breathe again, but they waited for her to lift her hands from the keys. She kept them there a second longer, savoring the stillness. Then, slowly, she let her hands fall to her lap. The room remained silent, not out of confusion anymore, but out of respect. They had finally understood her, even if she didn't know it yet. The moment she placed her hands on the piano keys felt heavier than anyone in the room could understand. It was not just about playing a song. It was about letting out a part of herself she had kept hidden for so long. The room had gone quiet, but not in a warm way. It was the kind of silence filled with doubt, with eyes waiting to see something go wrong. She could feel every stare on her back as if they were tiny weights pushing her down. She took a slow breath, the kind she used to take when she practiced alone in her small room, where no one judged and no one laughed. Her fingers rested gently over the keys. She did not rush. She wanted to make sure her hands were steady. Even though they trembled a little, she held her posture firm. She remembered the many times she had told herself, "One day, you will show them, and you won't need any words to do it." Her first touch on the keys created a soft sound, simple and light. It was almost like a whisper. A few people leaned forward, expecting it to fall apart. But the whisper grew into a steady line of notes that floated across the room. Some heads lifted, surprised by how clean the sound was. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was calm, controlled, and unexpectedly full of feeling. As she continued, her hands began to move more naturally. The fear inside her slowly untied itself, loosening the tightness in her chest. She allowed the melody to guide her. Every key she pressed brought back memories of early mornings when she practiced before school, or late nights when the world outside was quiet and she could hear her heart clearer than anything else. The people who had laughed earlier were now watching with confusion. They were expecting a mess, something funny or awkward, but there was nothing funny about the way she played. It had honesty, something real, something that showed she had carried music in her heart long before this moment. A woman in the front row began to relax her posture, her expression softening as the melody grew. A man who had crossed his arms loosened them slowly. Even the teens who had whispered jokes now stayed still, unsure of what to say. The room changed without anyone speaking. Her music filled the space more strongly than any voice could. As her confidence rose, she shifted into a more complex part of the piece. Her hands moved faster now, lifting and dropping with certainty. The notes blended smoothly, forming patterns that showed skill far beyond what anyone expected. The instructor, who had watched with mild doubt at first, now leaned slightly forward, eyebrows raised in disbelief. She wasn't trying to impress them. She wasn't trying to prove anyone wrong. She was simply letting the music inside her finally speak. For years she had practiced in silence, not because she wanted to hide, but because she never felt ready to share. Now she was here, standing where she once feared to stand, doing something she once thought she couldn't do in front of others. The room that had been full of laughter earlier now felt different. It was warmer, softer. People who had looked at her with judgment were now looking at her with surprise, even respect. The shift was so slow and so quiet that no one noticed exactly when it happened. But it did. Halfway through the piece, she closed her eyes gently. She didn't need to see the keys anymore. Her fingers knew them like old friends. She trusted her memory. She trusted her heart. The room didn't exist for a moment. It was just her and the piano, the same way it had always been. Every rise and fall of the melody carried a part of her story. The slow notes held the moments when she doubted herself. The faster ones carried her determination. The nights she didn't give up even when her hands cramped or when she made the same mistake again and again. She had worked for this silently, without applause, without guidance, without anyone telling her she was good. And now, as she played, something inside her finally felt seen. The people listening could feel it too. Even those who had judged her without giving her a chance now sat with a different expression. Some felt a quiet guilt. Some felt admiration. All of them felt surprise. When she reached the most intense part of the piece, her hands moved quickly, dancing across the keys. The sound filled every corner of the room. It wasn't only about skill, it was the feeling behind it that made people silent. It was real. It was alive. The melody then softened again, calming like a gentle breeze after a strong wind. Her fingers slowed, giving each note room to breathe. She let the final notes fall with care, letting them fade naturally into the quiet room. When the last sound disappeared, she lifted her hands slowly from the keys. Her heart pounded, not from fear anymore, but from relief. She had done it. She had finally shared a part of herself she had protected for so long. For a moment, no one moved. The silence was different now. It wasn't doubtful. It wasn't mocking. It was the kind that comes when people witness something meaningful and need a second to take it in. Then, a soft clap came from the back. One person. A second later, another joined. Then the claps grew louder, spreading across the room. The applause filled the space just as strongly as her music had. People looked at her with eyes full of something new. Respect, amazement, even a little regret for ever doubting her. She didn't smile widely or look for praise. She simply nodded gently, her expression calm. Inside, though, she felt something warm. She felt seen in a way she had never felt before. The instructor approached her with slow steps, almost as if they were unsure how to speak. There was admiration in their eyes. The teens who had laughed earlier looked away, embarrassed now, unsure how to face her. She stood up from the bench, her hands still warm from the keys. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. Everyone had heard everything they needed through her music. As she stepped away from the piano, she felt lighter. She had walked into the room carrying doubt and fear. She left with quiet strength. She had asked to play. Everyone had laughed. So she did. And in doing so, she changed more than the sound of the room. She changed the way they saw her, and even more, the way she saw herself. The room was still filled with the sound of applause echoing softly in the air when she stepped away from the piano. Even though the clapping had stopped, the feeling it left behind stayed warm, like sunlight that lingers after the clouds move. She stood there quietly, unsure where to look or how to react. She had never imagined that people who once laughed at her would now be the ones clapping for her. As she took a small step back, she noticed some faces she had seen earlier. The same people who had whispered jokes and smiled in a way that wasn't kind. Their expressions were very different now. Some seemed embarrassed, their eyes lowered. Others looked surprised, almost as if they were seeing her for the first time. Felt strange but also freeing to watch their reactions change. She didn't feel angry toward them. She didn't even feel proud in a loud way. What she felt was something quiet and deep, something close to relief. For so long, she had carried her talent inside, as if it were a secret she wasn't allowed to share. Now that she had opened it, even for just a moment, she felt lighter. The instructor approached her slowly, almost carefully, as if stepping closer to her required thought. Their eyes were warm, filled with a mix of surprise and admiration. When they finally stood in front of her, they didn't speak right away. They simply looked at her for a moment, trying to find the right words. "That was incredible," the instructor finally said, their voice soft. "How long have you been playing like that?" She shrugged a little, not wanting to make a big deal of it. "A while," she said quietly. "A while." The instructor blinked as if they were trying to understand how something so simple could explain something so beautiful. "You need to join our music group. We have performances, events, opportunities. I would love to see you grow even more." She didn't answer right away. Her heart warmed at the offer, but she wasn't used to praise. She still felt like she needed time to understand everything that had just happened. Behind the instructor, a small group gathered, the same people who had doubted her before. They walked up slowly, their steps unsure. One of them looked especially nervous, almost afraid to speak. "Hey," they said softly. We shouldn't have laughed earlier." Another added, "Yeah, we didn't know you could play like that." They all nodded awkwardly, each one trying to show they meant their apology. She looked at them, not with anger, but with calm understanding. She wasn't interested in making them feel worse. She simply nodded, accepting their words. That was enough. One of them took a slow breath. "You were amazing," they said honestly. She gave a small smile, not a big one, just enough to show she appreciated the kindness. It felt strange to receive so much attention, but it also felt good to know that she didn't have to hide anymore. The room around her began to return to its regular rhythm. People chatted softly, some replaying her performance in their minds, others speaking about how they hadn't expected someone so quiet to carry such skill. It felt unusual to hear people talk about her, but she tried not to let the attention overwhelm her. She stepped aside, giving others space to move around the room. A few younger children stared at her with wide eyes, as if she had done something magical. One little girl shyly walked up to her. "Can you teach me one day?" the girl whispered. Her heart softened at the innocent question. She nodded gently. "Maybe one day," she replied. The girl smiled brightly before running back to her family. As the event continued, the instructor spoke to her again. "You know," they said thoughtfully, "talent like yours shouldn't stay hidden. If you ever feel ready, we would love to have you perform again." She nodded, appreciating the offer even if she wasn't sure when she would feel ready to perform in front of so many people again. But now at least she knew she could. Later, as the crowd began to leave and the room slowly emptied, she found herself alone with the piano again. She walked over and touched the edge of it gently, feeling the smooth wood beneath her fingers. This piano, old and worn, had become part of a moment she would remember for a long time. She sat on the bench again, but this time she didn't play. She just sat quietly, letting everything settle inside her. The lights above her hummed softly. The silence around her felt peaceful. She thought about all the evenings she had practiced in her room, the way she would close the door, sit in front of her keyboard, and forget about everything else. No one had ever heard her then. No one knew how hard she had worked. But she knew, and that was enough. Now, though, she had shared a part of herself she once kept hidden. And in doing so, she had opened a new path she didn't expect. The instructor approached once more, carrying a small folder. "Before you go," they said, handing it to her, "these are schedules for our upcoming music sessions. No pressure. Just look at them when you feel ready." She took the folder quietly and nodded in thanks. As she walked toward the door, she heard a few people whispering. Not in a mocking way, but in a genuinely amazed way. It almost made her smile. She stepped outside into the cool air. The sky was starting to shift into deeper shades of evening. She felt the breeze against her face, gentle and calming. She inhaled deeply, feeling a sense of freedom she hadn't felt before. She knew this day would stay with her, not because of the applause, not because people finally saw her talent, but because she proved something important to herself. She proved that even when people laugh, even when doubts surround her, she doesn't have to shrink. She doesn't have to hide. She can stand up. She can try. She can shine. And she did. She walked home with a soft smile, the kind that comes from a quiet victory. She didn't need to brag. She didn't need to replay the moment again and again. It lived inside her, strong and steady. Her music had spoken for her. And from now on, she knew it always would.